All right. Hey, everyone. Today I will be talking about moral realism and the problem of motivation. So, welcome, everybody. Thanks for being here. It usually takes a few minutes for people to roll in. So, hopefully, people will start doing that. In the meantime, I'm going to read a relatively short, compared to some of my other blog post that I wrote. Is one of the first blog posts that I wrote on my blog, Lancet Dependent, same name as the channel, way back in August when I first started the blog. Now, for those of you who are new to the channel, my name is Lance Bush. I study the psychology of metaethics. That's sort of my main area of research. But more generally, I do moral philosophy, moral psychology, and metaphilosophy. And I take a rather strong empirical approach to addressing a lot of philosophical questions, or at least questions that are typically construed as questions to be dealt with through standard philosophical methodology. Now, I have problems with how people characterize standard philosophical methodology. I see the methods of philosophy as broadly continuous with the sciences, and that's the approach I like to take to addressing these issues. And so a lot of my research has a strongly interdisciplinary vibe to it. Especially, I draw on psychology for addressing questions in metaethics, so questions about the nature of morality. And a lot of my research is on how non-philosophers think about these traditionally philosophical questions in metaethics. I work in some other areas a little bit, free will and some other stuff, but I tend to have this really, at least in the past few years, sharp focus on metaethics. So, metaethics is this abstract branch of moral philosophy that deals with questions about the fundamental nature of morality. So questions about, it actually kind of spans a lot of the different sort of major branches of philosophy and draws on questions in metaphysics and epistemology. And it asks questions like, are there objective moral facts? If so, how can we know about them? Are moral beliefs intrinsically motivating? That sort of thing. Now, the typical topic I focus on is moral realism. I'm typically very critical of a lot of the realist accounts. And one of the things people might have heard from me before is this sort of trilemma, where, you can call it a trilemma, trichotomy, whatever you want to call it, where what I argue is that all accounts of moral realism are either trivial, false, or unintelligible. And I think what makes this view a little more distinctive than a lot of what you'll see in conventional anti-realist accounts of morality is that most of them will tend to focus on moral realism being false. There are arguments, and I didn't invent triviality objections. Triviality objections are typically leveled against naturalist accounts of moral realism that don't seem to be capable of capturing the sort of irreducibly normative elements of morality, or that try to dispense with its, there's various terminology. There's terminology people use: oomph, clout, force, authority. There's no settled terminology. But a lot of what non-naturalist realists want out of morality is for it to have this sort of force to compel, to motivate you to act, you must comply with it. And that's the topic that I'll be talking about today. And some naturalist accounts are like, look, we can have these objective, or I prefer the term stance-independent moral facts, without having to have all that. And my concern with these accounts is that they look to me to end up being, for the most part, merely descriptive accounts. They look like they're saying, hey, there's these mundane facts, like facts about how to increase well-being or facts about how to promote cooperation. Those are the moral facts. And, if you were offering a scientific theory of the disposition of humans to make certain types of judgments, and you came up with this theory and you say, okay, well, humans via natural selection evolved to have this evolved predisposition to develop cooperative systems or to pursue the well-being of themselves, their friends, and their family, or whoever they assign moral value to, whatever. There's various empirical sort of psychological accounts that you can give. Okay, well, let's say that it's true that people have a predisposition to think about, to make judgments, and to speak in certain sorts of ways, such that different communities tend to reliably develop this type of discourse, moral discourse, where they tend to talk about and make judgments of a certain kind. So they say stuff like murder is wrong, stealing is wrong, lying is wrong. And ultimately what's causing, or what can sort of unify our account of what's going on in these different discourses across different cultures and in different languages, is that they're making judgments that are facilitating a cooperative norms within their group that promote cooperation or increase well-being or serve the interests of the group, or whatever the naturalist account is. Okay, well, I can agree that there's facts of that kind And, maybe there's facts about how people use language, and maybe there's facts about the evolutionary history. But when I'm trying to decide what to do, the fact that humans evolved to think a certain sort of way or to act a certain sort of way is of very little interest to me. Like, okay, so what if people evolved to have cooperative norms? What if I don't want to cooperate? Should I cooperate? And so, this is something that some realists will say, those accounts that aren't bringing in this element that there's just facts about what you ought to do, what you should do, that have some kind of authority over you, some kind of practical authority, some type of force or oomph or clout to compel action, then you're really talking about something that is at best kind of inert and descriptive and doesn't really do the work that I think some people want to get out of a moral account. And I'm sympathetic to that. The interesting kinds of realism are the ones that do that. On a lot of these naturalist accounts, I just also think that the descriptions are typically pretty unconvincing anyway. I just don't think that the empirical case that they may have for here's what the moral facts, people happen to use the moral facts in this way or whatever, I tend not to find those very persuasive. So I tend to think the accounts are both false, and even if they were true, like conditional in them being true, they would be trivial. And then, of course, if they try to incorporate the irreducible normativity or some of these other sorts of concepts that non-naturalists have an easier time with, then I would tend to regard them as unintelligible. And then I tend to regard most of the non-naturalist accounts of realism as unintelligible. So that's a sort of basic overview. But today I'm going to be talking about moral motivation. So let me get into this early blog post. Now, I was very new to blogging when I wrote this. The first couple of posts were responses to other people. And then this, I think, might have been the first one where I just wrote a blog post. So it was a bit stream of thought. There's probably some mistakes in it. And I don't think it's organized as well as some of my newer blog posts. They're blog posts. These are not formal essays that you can spend weeks or months really, working them into something where you're really happy with the finished product. These are more, I write it up and you go with it. So let me share this one and let's have a go. And I pinned a link to it, and it should be posted in the description for the video as well. All right, let's go. According to moral realists, there are stance-independent moral facts. Such facts dictate which actions are morally right, wrong, permissible, impermissible, good, bad, and so on. What I typically say about various accounts of moral realism is that all forms of moral realism are trivial, false, or unintelligible. Most disputes between moral realists and anti-realists center on 2, false, with the anti-realist arguing that moral realism is false. I tend to emphasize 3, unintelligible, arguing that many forms of moral realism strike me as unintelligible, especially non-naturalist forms of moral realism. However, 1, trivial, is actually one of the more interesting problems of moral realism. The claim that some forms of moral realism are trivial. It's difficult to characterize just what I have in mind by trivial. That will be a discussion for the future. And as an aside here, I am working on something where I lay out in greater detail what I mean myself when I articulate the triviality objection. There are others that have raised triviality objections against various types of naturalist accounts. Anyway, returning to the post. Part of the issue is that I have several different things in mind. At least one easy way an account of moral realism faces a triviality challenge is if it doesn't purport to offer irreducibly normative facts, or, that is, if it effectively jettisons normativity in favor of a purely descriptive account. If, for instance, one's account of moral facts is that they are analytically equivalent to facts about what increases or decreases well-being, such an account faces a kind of triviality, namely that such facts alone can't compel action. As various anti-realists have put it, such an account would lack clout, practical oomph, or practical authority. In other words, we could simply ignore such facts without cost. The relation between certain analyses of the moral facts and motivation, normativity, and so on is fraught. If the realist insists that some thesis or theses, such as motivational internalism, the claim that moral beliefs are necessarily, if defeasibly motivated, they could maintain that the triviality concern may be dealt with. That's a big topic and one I'll set aside for now. So here I'm signposting a lot of the things that I'll be discussing in the blog. Some of them I already have, and some that I'll be discussing in the future. Here, I want to focus on a more straightforward and general sense in which all forms of moral realism, taken at face value, that is, without the inclusion of some extraneous set of theses, such as motivational externalism, strike me as trivial. I simply do not care what the moral facts are, whatever they turn out to be. I act only in accordance with my goals and interests. If the moral facts aren't aligned with those goals and interests, so much the worse for the moral facts. I simply do not care. Yet this isn't simply a matter of me not caring. I suspect that people in general are incapable of acting without being motivated to act. And I suspect that people are only motivated to act in accordance with their goals and desires. And if you're wondering, this isn't some novel thesis I came up with. This is more or less just a Humean account, which has been around for a long time. And it's one of the more common objections that anti-realists raise. Anyway, the latter remark often arouses a frustrating digression to deal with complaints. Well, someone could desire to do something that isn't in their own interests, like a bad habit. Yes, human psychology is complicated and we can have competing drives and interests. I may really want to stay up late writing angry comments about moral realism, but I may also want to get a good night's sleep. These goals can conflict with one another, and I could find myself compelled to act in accordance with the former goal, despite, on reflection, recognizing that the latter is more prudent. Strangely, analytic philosophers suddenly become interested in empirical facts about human psychology when it will conveniently allow them to obscure matters and avoid engagement with the shortcomings of their views. That we may have competing drives or interests is irrelevant. I'm not suggesting that we have a single motivation system in the brain that proceeds sequentially, prompting us to act on one motivation, then the next. The empirical reality can be far messier than that. I'm simply pointing out that we act on such motivations, goals, and drives, whatever their underlying structure and relationship to one another. Well, we don't act based on possible actions that are not in any way aligned with the psychological processes prompting us with the various competing drives and motivations that we experience. For instance, I may have competing goals to 1, stay up late, and 2, go to sleep. Whatever way I ultimately resolve this conflict, I'm going to do 1, stay up late, or 2, go to sleep. But since I have no desire, motivation, or goal whatsoever to go stand outside in the cold, dark, and rain all night, that simply isn't part of my motivational profile. It's not that I can't do it, although that would be true in a certain sense, possibly. It's that I won't do it unless conditions change. If someone offered me $10,000 to stand outside the cold, dark, and rain all night, then I would do it. But I do it because I want $10,000. That is, my actions always follow in accordance with my goals and interests. Now back to realism. Some people may have the motivation to do whatever is morally right or wrong, regardless of what that turns out to be. Some moral realists may insist that the moral facts are circumscribed by our intuitions or are self-evident or in some other way limited to some plausible set of actions in the vicinity of conventional motivational profiles. I'm not convinced. I don't see any good reason why it wouldn't be logically possible for the stance-independent moral facts to be radically different from what we think they are. I should flag here that I think I would want to make a stronger claim. It's not just that I think it's logically possible. I don't see any particularly good reason to think that the moral facts would happen to be aligned with what moral realists think that the normative content of those facts would be. And there's various reasons why. A big factor for me is that I think under reasonable counterfactual considerations, that human moral systems that happen to dominate in any particular philosophical community could be radically different than whatever they happen to be. Anyway, setting that aside. Even if we think this is very unlikely, that's irrelevant to the point I'm going to make. And that point is this. Suppose the moral facts turned out to be misaligned with your personal goals, values, and interests. Would you nevertheless comply with the moral facts? No, I don't think you would. It's not just that I don't think you'd have any interest in doing so. I think you simply wouldn't, full stop. Why would you? The moral facts aren't aligned with your goals or interests. They would be as motivationally inert as any random suggestion to perform any particular action, independent of its connection to your goals and values. Screaming at tables, eating socks, and so on. Moral realists can insist that the moral beliefs just are intrinsically motivating. Well, fine. Then these realists are welcome to conduct the proper empirical studies to see if anyone actually has moral beliefs of the relevant kind. That is, beliefs that would be intrinsically motivating. If it turns out that humans are psychologically constituted in such a way that they don't have anything corresponding to these putatively intrinsically motivating beliefs, then it would simply turn out that people don't have moral beliefs, where by moral beliefs we understand them to be intrinsically motivating. If so, philosophers will have dreamed up a type of psychological state that nobody actually has, or perhaps some people have them, perhaps moral realists, and others don't. I can't resolve empirical questions about the connection between belief and motivation here. If realists want to insist on any particular thesis, the onus is on them to make a case for it, and I doubt they're going to get there via a priori reasoning alone. I can't get there through a priori reasoning alone either, but such reasoning can perhaps do some argumentative work. I have in mind Don Loeb's excellent and amusing article on gastronomic realism, and you should check it out. If you haven't already, it's a fun article. And I think I'll probably do a whole video on that at some point. Anyway, gastronomic realism is the view, and this is not a view I've heard of anybody really endorsing or defending outside of this article. There are some interesting views. Some people will say, hey, look, maybe normative realism can apply more broadly. So I think it's certainly possible and consistent to endorse a view like this. Anyway, gastronomic realism is the view that there are stance-independent gastronomic facts about what we should and shouldn't do, gastronomically speaking. I should say eat or drink. This should not be confused with other reasons we might have to eat certain foods, nutritional value, ethical considerations, and so on. Rather, it's that we have gastronomic reasons to eat certain foods in virtue of their superior gastronomic properties. So I want to pause here for a moment just to clarify. Gastronomic realism says that certain foods and drinks that are gastronomically better than other ones or worse than other ones, and that we, in virtue of this, have certain sorts of obligations with respect to what we should or shouldn't and ought not eat. And these facts are not reducible to our desires or preferences. So it's not that you should eat one thing rather than another because it tastes better to you. And it's not that you should eat it because it costs less money or because it was produced in a more ethical way or because it's more nutritional. That can draw in a variety of other non-gastronomic normative considerations, moral considerations, prudential considerations, other sorts of considerations that would fall within other normative domains. The gastronomic domain is sui generis. It's an autonomous, distinct normative domain that says that in virtue of their gastronomic properties alone, those gastronomic properties provide gastronomic reasons to eat certain foods and drink certain drinks, and to avoid eating certain foods and avoid drinking certain drinks solely and exclusively in virtue of their gastronomic properties. Loeb is hesitant to present this, gastronomic realism as a reductio, but gastronomic realism serves as a kind of parody of the rationales offered for moral realism, lampooning it via unflattering comparison. Consider just what gastronomic realism would commit us to. Gastronomic facts obtain independent of our taste preferences. If it's a gastronomic fact that you ought to eat chocolate ice cream rather than vanilla, then gastronomically speaking, you ought to eat chocolate ice cream rather than vanilla, even if you prefer vanilla and dislike chocolate. Suppose you were sitting down to enjoy a dinner and you were confronted by a group of gastronomic realists. You had intended to order a souffle. They insist that you should not. Instead, you should order the peach galette. It is far better, they insist. But suppose you're not fond of peaches. You quite like the souffle and have no interest in the peach galette. You don't understand, they say. You have a gastronomic obligation to eat the peach galette instead of the souffle. If you order the souffle, you would be gastronomically incorrect. Suppose, all else being equal, you simply have no desire to eat the galette, but would greatly enjoy the souffle. Suppose you're an excellent judge of your food preferences and have tried both at this exact restaurant on numerous occasions. Every time you've tried the souffle, you've liked it, and every time you tried the peach galette, you found it was unappealing. You have no reason to think this has changed. In short, you know you would enjoy the souffle and would dislike the peach galette. What would you do? All else being equal, I'm confident you'd order the souffle. Perhaps the gastronomic realist could prompt you to eat a galette, but why would you do so if you did? If they seem dangerous, you may order it to avoid conflict, or they may offer to pay for your dinner, or they might implore you to insist that they'd be personally devastated if you didn't order the galette. Yet notice in all of these cases that the only factors relevant to what you decide to do would involve changes to your incentives that impacted your motivations in some way. Now suppose they sat down and argued with you about your decision. I insist you provide a justification for ordering this souffle. On what grounds can you justify eating it instead of the galette? You could say, because I want to. But why bother? Why think you need a justification for anything that you do? Yet they might insist you simply are not justified in eating the souffle unless you could provide a justification. And if you appeal to your goals and preferences or anything other than stance-independent gastronomic normative facts, you're not giving, quote, real reasons for what you do. None of this flimsy stance-dependent or non-normative nonsense is adequate. Without an appeal to genuine, robust, stance-independent gastronomic facts, you are simply not justified in eating whatever you want. After all, you have to have a reason to do what you do, and while your goals and preferences may provide reasons to eat what you want, there are external reasons to eat the galette, these gastronomic reasons. Such reasons are independent of your goals, standards, and values, and critically, they are overriding. And if you don't think they're overriding, Fine, I stipulate that they're overwriting. I've declared that they're overwriting. So now what? And I could say that I have a strong intuition, it seems to me, that they're overwriting. Now, what are you going to do? And what if I get enough philosophers to agree with me? Now it's really looking like, most of the experts think you have overriding reasons to eat the peach galette. You better eat it. It simply does not matter if you want to eat the souffle. Your reasons for eating the galette are overriding and thus provide more reason to eat the galette than to eat the souffle. Your goals aren't adequate to justify eating the souffle because our goals, preferences, and values are arbitrary. Absent a philosophically defensible rationale, you are therefore incorrect if you eat the souffle. How would you react to this situation? Would you have any interest in providing a justification for your decision to order the souffle? Would you listen to all this, realize you don't have any justification for eating the souffle, and abandon your decision to eat the souffle and instead eat the galette, knowing you won't like it? Now, generalize this to, and I think these are rhetorical questions. I think the answer is almost certainly no for most people, but hey, that's an empirical question. Now, generalize this to all of your decisions about what you eat. Would you only comply with the gastronomic facts about what's gastronomically good or bad and stop concerning yourself altogether with what you want to eat, with what tastes good or bad to you? This is how morality seems to me. It seems like someone coming along and insisting I, quote, should do things, regardless of whether I have any interest in doing so, and indeed, that I must do so. My answer to moral realists is simple. No. What now? What happens if I just don't do what's moral? What's the moral realist going to do? Tell me I'm morally incorrect or that what I did was morally bad? So what? Why should I care about that? There is no cosmic force that will annihilate my soul if I don't comply with the, quote, moral facts. Is the moral realist going to insist I'm not being rational? Again, so what? If being rational required me to do things that don't serve my interests, then so much for the notion of rationality. I'll pass. Moral realism is a product of conceptual and linguistic mistakes. And here I'm shifting away from the topic and talking about my own view on the matter. It's the sanctification of alleged folk terms, as though we're bound by oath to comply with the presumptions implicit in the way ordinary people, that is, non-philosophers, think and speak about matters. What makes this whole enterprise all the more pointless is that realists are wrong about what the folk view is. Moral realism is not built into the way ordinary people speak or think. Neither is anti-realism. These are philosophical inventions. Moral realism is a popular position among philosophers. If you look at the 2020 Phil Paper survey, there's 1,735 respondents to the survey. I don't remember the exact number that answered the question about metaethics, but it was 62% endorsed moral realism. If you just look at I think it was 228 that specialized in metaethics, you had 65%, so it actually went up a little bit. Anyway, I suspect this is due in part to analytic philosophy's bizarre goal of attempting to vindicate what it takes to be the common sense view. Unfortunately, in their effort to remain methodologically autonomous, philosophers eschew empirical research. This has resulted in a century lost to armchair speculation predicated on the mistaken notion that ordinary people think and speak like moral realists. As the evidence rolls in, it's becoming increasingly evident that they don't. As the case against folk moral realism grows, I suspect and I hope this will lead to a decline in moral realism among philosophers as the motivation to preserve the folk view declines with the knowledge that realism isn't even the folk view and is at best one among many. All right, so that is what I had written back at the time. And yeah, that I still am pretty sympathetic to what I wrote at the time. There's probably some things I'd do a little different. So this is an interesting question. Is there an ex-phil literature on humanism about reasons? No, not that I'm aware of. The closest to this is there's a few studies. I don't know. I haven't kept up with this literature. I read it a very long time ago, and I don't really remember what the results were. But there were a handful of researchers that were doing really interesting and cool work on the like X-Fi work in metaethics that was specifically on motivational internalism and externalism. And so it was looking at whether or not the participants in these studies should be non-philosophers. People, you'll see in the literature, they use the term the folk. I don't like that term. Some people would say lay people. I prefer the term non-philosopher because I think that that's the most descriptively accurate and straightforward way of characterizing the respondents that one has in mind. In any case, I honestly don't remember the results of that research. So I can't tell you what they found. My guess is that they probably found that people gave you probably didn't get like 95% externalists or 95% internalists. You probably got a mix of people expressing different sorts of views. I'm not as familiar because it's been many years since I looked at that, and it was way before I became more methodologically critical. I might find methodological problems with those studies. I don't know, but I suspect that they probably found a rather substantial pluralism and variation in the way that participants responded. But I just don't recall the results. So it's possible that they found something that was more uniform and more stable. I haven't seen a whole that literature. Unfortunately, there hasn't been as much research in there as I would like to see. But as far as I know, there hasn't been direct stuff on reasons in quite this way, like a direct account of Humeanism about reasons. But it's close, and there's some overlap there. So it is an area for future research. Okay, so someone's asking if I'm vegan. It's not really, I don't get into those sorts of questions. So sorry about that. I just want to talk about metaethics, metaphilosophy, moral psychology. So not going to get into that. Sorry if that's not a fun response. I tend to be a bit like I don't really talk about normative ethics on this channel, and I don't talk about like my stance towards like the different normative views like virtue ethics, utilitarianism, deontology. I just try to stay focused on the particular topics that I discuss on this channel. So that's something I'll probably discuss a broader range of topics in the future, probably sometime over the summer when I sort of expand the scope of the channel to start being developing in new areas. But right now my focus is on this stuff. All right, so that was the post. I don't know if I have a whole lot more to say about that. Does anyone else have any questions or comments about the motivation stuff? All right, I don't see anybody else commenting in the chat. So maybe I'll just close things out early today. All right, that's what I'll do. So thanks everybody for being here. I guess today it was basically me just reading the blog post. What I can say is that I'll have some more to say about this. I'm writing a couple more posts on motivation and this general issue. Yeah, I guess I could pause briefly to say something like this. What you'll sometimes see from moral realists is they'll just say, hey, look, if you're going to challenge the realist by saying, why should I do what's moral? You're not understanding what the realist is claiming. The realist is claiming that there are moral facts of a particular kind, and these facts just are what you should do. Like by definition, that's just the definition of what it means for there to be a stance-independent moral fact. I think, this is the kind of case where someone could just say, there's a few ways to respond to that. Personally, I just think that doesn't make sense. And that's because, I don't endorse a Humean account of reasons, because I don't think that desires give you or provide reasons. I'm a reasons quietist. I don't think that there are reasons. I think that this discussion of reasons in the philosophical literature is just all manner of conceptually and linguistically just mangled beyond recognition. It's really just a confused way of thinking about these sorts of things. I don't think that there are reasons. Like I don't think that that's how things. I think that they're using the terminology in a very strange way. They're reifying the terminology and treating it as though there can be reasons that exist in some way that's not reducible to some set of descriptive facts, where you could sort of discharge and eliminate any reference to the reasons. Basically, I think if you could account for all of the facts without appealing to the term reasons or that concept, I think you could talk about consistency relations between goals and desires, or means and ends, and like the facts about what actions would be consistent with achieving those goals or desires. And I don't think that we really need to talk about reasons in the sense that I think a lot of philosophers do. So I don't endorse a Humean account of reasons. I don't think that you have reasons for things to do things insofar as they comport with your desires. What I would say, though, is that I don't know what it would mean, and I don't think it's meaningful to speak of people having reasons for doing things that at the very least aren't reducible to descriptive facts of these consistency relations. So irreducibly normative facts that allegedly provide reasons, I think that talk just literally doesn't make any sense. And I do think that's in part because of a view I have, which my views are pretty sympathetic to something basically Humean, which is that I think people act in accordance with their goals, their desires, their motivations. And so if a person just doesn't have any motivation to comply with some fact, you could shout at them all day long that they must or they ought to, but too bad. Like they're just not going to. And I just don't think that that's the way that human psychology works. There's more complicated issues here. So someone might say, okay, but I could stipulate that there are certain kinds of moral considerations that would be motivating. Okay, well, if you're going to start talking about facts that in a certain way sort of interface with or interact with the psychology of an agent, then you're going to start having to deal with empirical concerns where, whether or not any particular agent, and by agent, I just mean a decision-making being. It doesn't have to be a human. It could be an AI. It could be an alien. It could be, all sorts of things. Whether or not any particular agent of any of these kinds is motivated by their beliefs seems to me to be a question about their cognitive architecture. So it could be that some beings are psychologically constituted in a way that some beliefs that they have prompt them to act in certain sorts of ways. And it's possible that there are other beings that are psychologically constituted in such a way that they're not prompted by their beliefs. Now, someone could say, but no, that's not the case, because just analytically, what it means to have a belief of the kind in question just is to be motivated. Okay, well, then I would say that some agents then don't have beliefs, or they don't have beliefs of that kind. So you're not going to be able to stipulate your way into saying that agents do or must have certain sorts of psychological capacities. You just can't do that, because then I could just say, okay, well, if you're going to say that a belief just is motivating by definition, then I would say that this is an agent and doesn't have beliefs. And if someone wants to say, but an agent has to have beliefs by definition, that's just, again, by stipulation. So you're just stipulating an agent as a being that has beliefs, and beliefs are necessarily motivating. That's just what I mean by those terms. Then I would just say, okay, well, then maybe humans aren't agents. That I don't care. Like, again, you're not going to be able to make the case by stipulation. If you're going to say that there's a belief and the belief motivates an action, whether or not humans meet those conditions is an empirical question. And something that I find really strange about a lot of the discussion on motivation and not just the human accounts, but whatever non-human accounts in these controversies that are centering on motivation and reasons, is that they seem to me to, there's a few things going on with them. They seem to me to be often engaging in empirical claims. So they'll say, we seem to experience morality this way, or we think about morality this way, or when we have moral beliefs, we have some motivation to act in accordance with them. And, who is we? Philosophers just are constantly saying we, or us, or, they use this language that seems to be inclusive of humanity as a whole. And they haven't done the psychological research to show that this is the case. And they might scoff at that and say, we don't need to do the psychological research. I don't agree. So most psychology has been done on college students, and in particular parts of the world like the United States. What researchers have found is that when they've gone and done cross-cultural research, that they often find rather extraordinary degree of variation around the world. And, a lot of this variation even concerns pretty straightforward moral judgments, but it even affects like visual cognition. So the variation that is out there is, quite extraordinary. Let me get to a question. I often will take like an hour to get to questions, so let me try to get to them a little quicker. Great. Do you think motivation argument for moral anti-realism is powerful? It depends how you're construing the argument. So if you want to put some form of the argument in there, I could let you know. I think that what you would be doing is just shifting the argument over a discussion like, hey, is the human account correct or not? And then you would just be moving the discussion over to that. Is that a strong argument? Maybe, I don't know how to evaluate the strength of these arguments. It's really going to depend on a lot of specifics. And, for me, I'm going to be looking at a lot of this discourse for whether or not both the realist and the anti-realist making arguments are relying too much on empirical presumptions that have not been tested, or for which there isn't substantial empirical evidence. And so you can kind of get this dilemma actually with some of these disputes. Sometimes when I've raised concerns like, let's take non-cognitivism. So non-cognitivism is the view that moral claims are not truth apt. They don't express propositions. They don't have propositional value. Okay, so if someone is making this claim, if they're a non-cognitivist and they have this semantic thesis, is that an empirical claim? Like, is it a claim about when a person says murder is wrong, about the communicative intent of that person? Is it a claim about their psychology? Well, maybe If it is, then we need to do the empirical work to find out who is using moral claims and how are they using them and how are you testing that and what's the evidence for that. There is empirical work on this. This is the research I do, but very few people in academic philosophy and metaethics or outside of it pay any attention to this research. And even when they do pay attention to it, I rarely see them go, well, that's what the research says. I guess we're wrong. Usually it's to critique the research. So I haven't seen a whole lot of people, taking up the findings from the various studies that have been conducted in the psychology of metaethics and going, okay, this is a big deal. We need to reorient our perspective on metaethics around, at least partially around this empirical research. I don't see very many people doing that. So, on the one hand, if these are empirical questions, I don't think philosophers are really engaging with or conducting empirical research in anything even approaching 5% of the amount that they would need to do to really address it. If they think it's a non-empirical question, okay, so moral claims don't express propositions. This is not an empirical claim. What's it a claim about? Oh, it's a claim about moral claims. Okay, whose moral claims? The ones people are using? Because what you'll see from philosophers is they'll say that their account is intended to be an account of ordinary thought or language or something like that. Okay, well, if it's about thought, then it seems like I don't know what the controversy being saying. Got to be an empirical claim. If it's about language, then okay, so their account of language is that the meaning of the sentences of moral claims has nothing to do or isn't reducible to the psychological states of the speakers. It's not about what speakers intend. Okay, then what does it amount to? How do we determine this? Typically, historically, what philosophers have done is they've taken these isolated, decontextualized sentences and they've analyzed them. They'll take a sentence, murder someone, and they go, well, look at it. It has the sort of structure of a propositional claim. And you have like the Frege-Geach problem, and you have, embedding, or, say, I don't know, throwing a person in a volcano is a type of murder. All murders are wrong. So throwing a person in a volcano is wrong. So it looks like you could take murder, various sorts of moral claims and embed them in a standard syllogism, or, you could reason, you could say, is it wrong? Or is this more wrong than that? So there's various sorts of ways that you can manipulate or make use of moral claims in ordinary discourse that make them look like they're functioning as propositions. And then people will take these hypothetical cases and say, see, so the moral, you don't need to do empirical research. The language is propositional. Moral claims function to express propositions. So, non-cognitivism is wrong. I find this to be very strange. And the reason I find it strange is because these sorts of analyses are looking at sentences that nobody is actually uttering. No one's using that sentence. It's a made up sentence. And it's trivially easy to give examples, at least in English, in like contemporary American English, like what I'm familiar with. There's, like anything, languages evolve and change over time. So I don't know what language would have looked like 200, 300, 400 years ago, or, and even if I did 200 years ago, okay, what about 500? What about 700? There's going to be a point where I'm not sure what people meant or how people communicated at a certain point in time. But at least currently, people do use seemingly propositional language to express non-propositional claims. And the example I typically give, a teenager wants to go to a party. Their parents told them they can't. It's late at night. They're sneaking out to go to the party. They're trying to get out the front door. They open the front door. The parents flip on the lights and say, you will not go to that party. Now look at what they said. You will not go to the party. That looks like a propositional claim, but listen to the tone. You will not go to that party. What are they doing? They're not necessarily, they're not making a prediction. It's going to rain. It is going to rain tomorrow. It is going to rain tomorrow is kind of a strange thing to do. A strange thing to say in this tone, as if you're causing it. But when the parents are saying you will not go to that party, they're not making a propositional claim. They're issuing an imperative, and they're using propositional language. They're stating it as a fact, as a means of emphasis. They're saying it like, we have declared that this future event will not happen. That's how firm our declaration of what is going to happen will be. And the implication is, so you better not go. It's an order. It's a command. It's an imperative. And so imperatives like shut the door isn't true or false. And neither is, in this context, you will not go to that party. It's not true or false. It's an imperative. So they're using, and you could ask them, are you making a propositional claim? And like, what do you mean? I don't study philosophy. And you explain it to them, and they're like, no, clearly not. I was issuing a command, and I was using propositional language as like a method of emphasis. So, okay, when people say you will not go to the party, do they typically use it to convey imperatives or propositional claims? I don't know. Look, The only way I think we could figure that out is to analyze everyday speech patterns and look at how the language is actually being used. And you could just bring this right over to morality and ask the question, when people in real world contexts make moral claims, are they making those claims in a way that they appear to be functioning to state facts or functioning to do something else, like express emotions but not state facts, or to express imperatives but not state facts? What if, and I don't think this is plausible, but it's logically possible, and it's possible, it's not so outlandish that it couldn't possibly be true. I don't think it's very likely, though. What if we did an empirical study where we had people record or report all the times that they made moral claims all through the day, something like that. And it turned out that, I don't know, 70% of the time they used moral claims to express emotions, and 22% of the time they used them to express imperatives. So that's two different types of non-propositional ways of speaking. And so that turns out to be 92% of the time. And only 8% of the time they use them to make propositional claims. Okay, so imagine we found that was the data. And we tested this all over the place, and we got really representative data. And then we did this all over the world, and we found this all over the world. That about, I don't know, 80, 90, 95% of the time, people used moral claims to use moral language, like moral sentences that look like propositional claims, to express non-propositional content like imperatives or emotional expressions, like "ow," so they're using it to express an attitude. Now what would we do? Well, it could still seem natural, and from the philosophical armchair, to embed the moral claims in sentences and in arguments and that sort of thing. And they look like they're functioning as propositions in those contexts because they can function as propositions. But simply because they can function as propositions doesn't mean that that's the primary, central, or most typical everyday usage for murder is wrong, or those sorts of standard moral claims. It could be that their standard prototypical usage is primarily to convey some non-propositional content, and they just happen to function in such a way, or to be structured in such a way, that they have sort of, grammatically they look like propositions, even though they're not typically used that way. So that seems like it would matter to me. If our goal is to figure out what the terms mean, we can ask the question, how are people using the terms? And it turns out that it would in fact, regardless of whether you're going to insist on cognitivism is false, it would turn out to be a fact that people typically use moral claims to express non-propositional content. Now, if you want to say moral claims are truth apt anyway, what does that mean? Because it's not an accurate description of their typical usage. So what is it a description of? The answer is I don't know, because I think that there are facts about how people use the sentences, and there are no other facts besides that. There isn't some meaning to the sentences beyond how people use them. So a sentence like "murder is wrong," there are facts about how people use it, and that's it. There aren't any other facts. I mean, I guess you could say there's facts about how people could use it, but they could use it in any way. You could say "murder is wrong," that could be used to say all sorts of things. You could also say there's facts about how people might use them, or you could say that there's facts about how people could use them that are more or less plausible. I mean, maybe there's some hypothetical facts about these sentences that go beyond the descriptive facts about how they are used to how they plausibly could be used. So maybe I could expand what, how my account of these things to include some stuff that's not purely reducible to descriptive facts about usage. But outside a fairly narrow window of these sorts of empirical expectations or descriptions of what's going on or what we would expect to go on, I don't know what philosophers are talking about, and I haven't heard a good account of what they're talking about when they say that moral claims are truth apt. Which ones? What are they talking about? Oh, right, got some more questions here. Sorry, yeah, see, I already went to 10 minutes. Sorry about that. Okay, do you think there's any value in reading old philosophy books like Plato and Aristotle in terms of learning philosophy? So it's a good question. If I have to pick an answer, I'm going to say no. I don't really think it's that valuable, but it's going to depend on your academic and or personal goals with what you want to study. So some people want to study the way that Plato or Aristotle thought, and I think the history of philosophy is important. I think it can be valuable to study what they said about things. I certainly think it can help contextualize what we say in contemporary context. So, for instance, I don't endorse virtue ethics, but one criticism that came out of 20th century ethics was, hey, ethics, for some reason, normative ethics, has become so focused on the analysis of the rightness and wrongness of, and permissibility and impermissibility and so on of actions and principles, that there's been comparatively less focus on character. And yet, the sort of progenitors of Western philosophy, Aristotle, Socrates, Plato, I said them out of order. Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and so, others, Stoics, Epicureans, well, I don't know that much about what all the different normative moral philosophies, but basically, ancient Greeks are known for this, virtue ethics approach, which is a lot more centered on the cultivation of particular virtues, character traits, courage, bravery. Those are the same. Courage, prudence. What else? Honesty. I don't remember all the virtues off the top of my head. That would be the sort of typical virtues. But there was a lot more focus on character and less of a focus on actions and principles. And drawing on that ancient work to say, hey, people used to think about morality in quite a bit differently than we are now. I think that could be quite useful. So I'm going to revise my answer. Do I think there's value in reading old philosophy? Yes. Part of the reason I think that there's importance in reading old philosophy is not because it's old, but because it reflects different sort of points in the timeline of then to now, where people had different cultural backgrounds, different languages, different experiences. And what you get a glimpse into is the way that people think philosophically outside of the contemporary analytic landscape, which is what most people are trained in at least the United States and in my education. There's, continental philosophy, there's other philosophical traditions, but a lot of analytic philosophy draws on people appealing to their philosophical intuitions and saying, it seems to me that. And I think that there is a failure to appreciate how deeply path dependent and culturally parochial a lot of the ways that people are disposed to think might be. And by reading a lot of older work, we could see people were very different in the past. And I suspect if we encountered, for instance, non-humans from other worlds, that they would think quite differently from us. And I think that if you look into the cross-cultural psychology on humans around the world, even today, what you'll find is there's quite a lot of differences. It doesn't mean that people are super different from one another, but you will find differences. And those differences are often surprising. And I think that philosophers often, if it's very culturally homogenous in the field, and they're all reading thinkers that are all, from the same cultures, from the same backgrounds, that you can get this very parochial perspective on what's possible for human thought. And I think that can actually distort people's conception of what people would be disposed to think, under counterfactual circumstances. And I think that lends itself to philosophers being very overconfident in imagining that the way that they think or speak reflects how other people think or speak. This is a very common theme in my criticisms of much of the way contemporary analytic philosophy operates. Unfortunately, I don't think when people go back and read a lot of this earlier work that they're necessarily sensitive to and receptive of these differences. So part of my concern with a lot of people studying ancient philosophy is I think a lot of people just take their current views and they project them back onto and reread ancient work in accordance with their current views. And, I think that this is pretty typical of what people will do. When they, for instance, read scriptures, I think a lot of people will just read their own moral perspective and philosophical views into the texts in a particular religion. So the religion is just whatever it says, they will find a way to make it say what they want it to say. They'll interpret it in that way. And I think that to some extent philosophers do this. So I think that I was initially inclined to say no. Then I sort of changed to a yes. And then now I want to say it, it depends. It depends on how you're approaching ancient philosophy and what you're doing with it. But I also do think that people can look into this work. Look, I enjoy reading Plato, but you're saying in terms of learning philosophy. So your question was specific. I think it can be useful if it's approached carefully and, people aren't dwelling too much on. I don't like an overly historically focused approach to learning philosophy where you're like, here's what this person thought. Here's what this person thought. Here's what this person thought. And then you move on. Okay, and were the arguments good? And, even if someone it says, by studying this work, you could analyze arguments, see where they went wrong. If you read Plato's dialogues, you will get some howlers in there, some really bad arguments, some really goofy stuff. Some of it might turn out to be less implausible than it seems once you understand the point. Some of it might have been intended as a joke, or it's tongue in cheek and it's not really intended to be taken seriously. I don't know. I'm not a scholar of Plato. So someone that is could say, oh yeah, totally, there's jokes in there. Someone could say, no, Plato just made some weird arguments. I don't really know. And this is why studying this could be helpful in analyzing that. How bad were the arguments actually? It's going to depend on whether they were all intended to be serious or not. So someone would have a better sense of that, whether there were jokes in there or just terrible arguments. So, but if that's really the case, if you really wanted to get good at analyzing arguments, I think you could probably do a lot better than just reading these texts. So I have I'll leave it at that. I have some ahistorical sympathies where often I think that some of the best ways to do philosophy are to read it in its clearest form. I often think that primary texts, certain philosophers I think are terrible writers. They're very hard to interpret. It might be helpful to get skill in reading bad writing, but you have to trade off the intense suffering that's associated with reading really terrible philosophical writing with, okay, so you might be getting something out of reading really opaque texts that are hard to understand, but you might also be getting something out of, there's opportunity costs. Then if you're doing that, then you're not reading clear, well-written argumentation. So I think philosophers need to reconsider what it is they want to achieve with learning philosophy. And if some people want to go the route of interpretation and digging into ancient texts, I think that's one approach. And one thing that I want that to flourish. It's not my emphasis though. So what I would say is, I think that this is useful for some people, but not really typically for my way of approaching things. All right. One more question, and then I'll close it out there. Would you say your claims about intelligibility of stance-independent moral facts is a form of queerness argument? I know this term is only associated with error theory, but still. So those sorts of arguments are metaphysical. And so the idea behind those is that there's something metaphysically questionable, hard to grasp about, or is it really, strange. Whatever these stance-independent moral facts would be, they would be something fundamentally unlike the conventional sorts of descriptive facts that we deal with. And this is an argument laid out by Mackey, and this was sort of one of the. There's actually different. Mackey's hard to interpret in there. This is one of those cases where it's like, why are there seeming to be 7 different arguments, and they're not distinguished from one another very very well. But it's fair to say, look, I might sit there all day and focus on, I'm going to come up with the clearest, most carefully articulated argument that I could come up with. But sometimes it's important just to get your ideas out there. So, even if it's some people got to come and clean up a little bit of the lack of clarity after the fact. Often whatever, so sometimes people don't make their ideas as precise as you might hope, but they still put the content out there and people could sift through it and find what's good in there. Anyway, so I would not consider it to be like that. So those arguments are not challenging the intelligibility of the claims that, for instance, a non-naturalist moral realist is that says that there's something, for instance, I think in Mackey's terms, something objectively prescriptive. I think a lot of error theorists are granting, at least error theory as I'm familiar with it, grants that moral realism isn't saying something unintelligible. It's saying something false. In fact, that's the whole point. So I haven't heard error theorists challenge the intelligibility of what moral realists are saying. In fact, many of them might even report that they have the intuition realists have. It would be a bit, you could make comparisons. It'd be a bit like, belief in God. So I think when people make God wants me to go to the store. That'd be a weird thing for God to want, but whatever. God wants me to go to the store. Well, insofar as the concept of God is intelligible and God wanting people to do things is intelligible, the statement is intelligible. God wants me to go to the store. But if God doesn't exist, then the statement is false. There isn't a God, so it's not true that God wants you to go to the store. And so I think error theorists typically treat moral realism largely in that way, where they grant that the claims in question are meaningful. They just think that they're false. There isn't anything that answers to those sorts of statements. They attempt to refer and they fail to refer. In the same way someone saying, God wants me to go to the store, fails to refer to something meaningful. Of course, someone could argue maybe God in general or this particular conception of God is unintelligible, but it's different. It's really a metaphysical thesis, and what I'm arguing about is a sort of conceptual, or you could say it's linguistic or something like that. It's a question about what is being asserted and whether what is being asserted even is propositional in the first place. And I think a lot of what non-naturalists are arguing for, the position, isn't propositional. It can't be evaluated as true or false because it isn't meaningful. So no, it's closer to a quietistic position, and it's a lot closer to something that you would get from Wittgenstein. So Wittgenstein had this lecture on ethics. I forget when it was, but you can find a transcript of it online. If you just Google Wittgenstein lecture on ethics, let me see if that works. 1 second. Yeah, it's the first thing that comes up as you'll find it. So Wittgenstein has this lecture on ethics. In fact, let me pull up the quote from this. Here it is. Oh. So there is the quote. I cut out the IC. Let me remove that. No, I hate when I copy and paste something and it does that. All right, here we go. Here's the remark. And let me see if I could put it up on here. Yeah. All right. I see now that these nonsensical expressions, and this is in reference in the lecture, the term used is something like absolute value or absolute morality or something like that. From the description given in there, it looks like it's a reference to moral realism. Anyway, I see now that these nonsensical expressions were not nonsensical because I had not yet found the correct expressions, but that their nonsensicality was their very essence. So that is pretty much the view that I'm taking on particular non-naturalist conceptions of moral realism, specifically any account which holds that there are irreducibly normative facts, or that anything could be irreducibly normative. I don't think that the notion of irreducible normativity makes any sense. I don't accept that the notion of normative reasons makes any sense. And I don't accept that there can be facts about what one ought to do simpliciter. I think that the general type of discourse that you'll see in these contexts, I think that it's literally not meaningful. So yeah, it's not a metaphysical claim. It's that I don't think that the proponents of these views are asserting anything that even amounts to a proposition that could be false. Now, to be fair, that could be underwritten by certain metaphysical or metaphilosophical presuppositions or commitments that I have. So for instance, I'm going to endorse some type of pragmatism, and that is going to be accompanied with certain accounts of meaning that I would favor. And then I don't think that the accounts on offer rise to the level of meeting those criteria. But what concerns me is that about a lot of this talk, like irreducible normativity, isn't merely that, like, given my commitments and views, I don't think the terms are meaningful. I'm not sure if they're meaningful on other people's construals of the meaning of these terms. And if they are meaningful, I don't know what that amounts to. So one of my central concerns with a lot of these non-naturalist accounts is an appeal to what they will say are unanalyzable, primitive, properly basic. They'll use this sort of terminology to say that the terms in question, if you want them to communicate the meaning of the terms, they can't do so because they're not analyzable. They're not able to articulate. Like, if you want an account, they can't give an account. It's a primitive concept. It's a concept that cannot be broken down further into sub-concepts that they could then say, well, it's a combination of this concept and that concept. Of course, I don't think that it's primitive. Sometimes it's used specifically to mean a concept that can't get broken down or construed by appeal to other concepts. But I'm not asking people, when I ask them what they mean by an irreducibly normative fact, like it's you ought to do this. What, and when I ask, what do you mean by ought? And I'm told it's unanalyzable. I'm not asking them what concepts is your term ought composed of, like what concepts is the concept composed of, as though I'm mistakenly asking them, it's an atomic concept, and I'm saying, what atoms is it? What atoms is your compound concept composed of? And they're like, it's not composed of two or more different types of atoms. It's one thing. It'd be like saying, what types of elements is gold composed of? Which two or more elements is it made of? That's a nonsensical question. Gold is one element. It's not composed of further elements. And so they'll sometimes I've had people say stuff like, well, it's a primitive concept. Okay, well, I'm not asking you what concepts it's composed of. I'm saying communicate in any way you can what you mean by the concept so I can acquire it. And unfortunately, I've made no progress in making these sorts of requests. And, that I think is really, really interesting, because what will happen is, what typically when people offer unanalyzable concepts, I find something really mysterious and strange and questionable about what's going on here, because, typically they'll say, okay, well, maybe I can communicate it with synonyms. Okay, no, that doesn't help me. So, you could go through this sort of loop of this terminological loop that sort of never terminates in someone saying something that I can gain any sort of conceptual entry to. So it's like someone saying, oh yeah, I believe in florps. Florps exist. You say, what's a florp? And they're like, it's a flarp. And you're like, that's not helpful. What's a flarp? And they're like, it's a fleerp. Okay, I don't know what a fleerp is. What's a fleerp? It's a flarp or a florp. That was the first one I said, right? Whatever. I can't even keep track. I'm making up words. A florp is a flarp. A flarp is a fleerp. A fleerp is a florp. And so you go in a loop and you're like, okay, I don't know what any of the terms mean. You need some conceptual entry point. And if you say, no, but I need to know what you're talking about. What is a fleerp? And they're like, this is a fleerp. Okay, now I know what it is. Or if they say a fleerp is a mug that's exactly 27% filled with liquid, or 34, whatever the percentage is in there, then I could say, oh, okay, now I know what those words mean. Now I know what you're talking about. But if you don't have a conceptual entry point, there's no way to sort of break the vicious cycle and understand what the person's talking about. And this is what will happen if someone's just giving me a bunch of synonyms. The other thing they might do is give examples. So, okay, what do you mean by ought? Well, I could say that you ought not torture people for fun. You shouldn't do that. That's bad. Okay. And you ought not lie just for fun to manipulate people. Okay. These examples aren't helpful because I don't know what they mean. It'd be like I don't know what the examples are supposed to be examples of. What characteristics do they share in common? Now, I'm not saying that giving examples is a bad way to communicate things. In fact, it could be a great way to communicate things, but typically they're examples where they're in a certain sense accessible to the person. And I don't know, when they're giving me these examples, what I'm supposed to be accessing other than the description itself. So if someone describes an act of stealing and describes an act of lying and describes an act of harming someone for fun, okay, yeah, I get all of that. I have the descriptions. And you could even say that there's things that they have in common. Like, for instance, these things will have in common the fact that the person disapproves of them, or the fact that they don't want you to do them, or the fact that they're saying you shouldn't do them. But again, I don't know what they mean by that. Do they mean that they're going to stop me? Do they mean they're going to be upset? If you ask them, they'll say, well, it's just a fact you ought not to. What do you mean? What if you wanted to do the thing? Well, you shouldn't anyway. It's not about what you want. Okay, then what is it about? Well, it's about the facts. Okay, but what are the facts? The facts are that you shouldn't do them. So it's this loop, and the examples don't illuminate the content of the terms used in the loop. So examples and synonymy don't get you anywhere, and I don't think there's anything else. But what's strange about these sorts of scenarios is that they could say this to another person, the person go, I know what you mean, but then they can't tell you. So somehow they're able to communicate with each other, but they're not able to communicate with me. And the problem is supposed to be with me because they're all saying they get it, but it's unclear what it is they're getting. So I don't know what's going on here. I don't think the problem is my conception of things. I think that people are getting tripped up over language. I think that there's something strange going on with the way that they're using words. And I am not inclined to think that there are unanalyzable and incommunicable concepts. I think if a concept is meaningful, it can be communicated. And, that might be a controversial claim, but hey, I get to make controversial claims. I'm allowed. What are they going to say? I ought not to. So I suspect that, and, it's not even that I'm like dogmatically insistent on it. I'm happy to have someone explain. Here's here's an unanalyzable concept I think you already have, but I haven't encountered one yet. So yeah, I don't know. That is really at the center of this problem. Okay, so I've reached an hour. I said I was going to go like a half hour ago, but I think I'm happy with where things ended up there. Thanks everybody for being here. And yeah, hopefully I got to people's responses a little bit quicker than I have in the past. And I will see you all later. Thanks for being here.